We are a bunch of pre-modernists who are in some way approaching various questions through the lens of materiality, corporeality, things like that. Um, and so we come together, we share our work, we um, love to hear about other people's work. We decided to start this venture as a way to sort of connect with other people who are doing similar kinds of things or who are interested, whether they're academics or not. So that's us. I'm Autumn. There's Francesca and there's James. We are the team. And we will kind of introduce ourselves as we go along today. Because today, what we're doing is instead of having a brilliant, wonderful speaker, we are the speakers. We are going to be giving you a little taster of our Leeds round table. We thought it would be a good opportunity for people to get a sense of what we individually are working on, where we're making these connections so that we can work together. And I don't know, maybe you'll hear something that is very interesting to yourself, and maybe you'll want to hang out with us and do some research. So, on that note, the Leeds Roundtable, the Leeds theme is about knowledge transmission this year. So we were thinking about this and how we are going to approach this as a team of people working on kind of disparate things. And our session title is Suppression and Celebration, Exploring the Role of Women in Medieval and Early Modern Religious Discourse, which is a very scholarly title and a great way to say we're just going to talk about our individual research and how it in some way facilitates the transmission of knowledge. And we're going to do so through that body lens again. Um, so I'm Autumn, and I am a hair's breadth away from finishing my PhD at the University of Alberta. Uh, I need to just do that pesky last bit of writing. And I am in the religious studies department where I study early modern gender and religion in England. Specifically, I'm interested in something called the churching of women or the purification of women, which is a ceremony that took place to sort of welcome women back to church after like a ritual period of absence after birth, usually about 4 weeks or so. Has its roots in Leviticus and in Jewish purity laws, although some scholars will argue with you about that. I will not. um, and a lot of my work, and I'm an early modernist, as I said, so like I'm a little different from Francesca and James in that sense, in that I'm looking to the medieval period to sort of contextualize the work that I'm doing. So even though it's focused in this early modern period, I am living very much lately in the 11th and 12th century Lateran reforms in England, um, and thinking about how clerical marriage sort of ties into this popularization of the churching ceremony, but I'll talk more about that later. Anyhow, I'm very interested in how women's bodies have, through the liturgy, or many liturgies really, been used to transmit knowledge and ideas about changing religious and social and even political priorities. So, what I mean by that, is to go back to what I just said about clerical marriage, is that, um, and I'm not unique in this, a lot of people argue this, that the imposition of clerical celibacy in, the 11th, 12th, it was a long battle. Not everyone wanted to be celibate, but the imposition of that celibacy um, can be connected to a sudden popularization of the rite of purification for new mothers. And in my own work, I am arguing that the church and its sort of newfound ability to decide, who's legitimately married and who's not, is suddenly pronouncing all of these couples as not actually legally wed. And one way to really enforce that is to deny churching to clerical wives, who are now called clerical concubines, so that churching becomes almost a means of legitimizing offspring marriages, but also transmitting this new idea about clerical celibacy and sort of this new idea about clerical manhood and what it means to be a clerical man. So that's where a lot of my work intersects medievally, but in the early modern period, it happens again. So obviously, in the early modern period in England, where I'm focused, you have this. Um, you have these reformers who are very interested in bringing back clerical marriage. And so these same arguments come up yet again, but they're used to different effect. So we start hearing about women's purity and sort of that idea of women being impure because they've had sex as sort of being like anathema now. Protestants had a very different view of that. And so um, all this literature gets produced, all these, polemical pamphlets get produced talking about women's bodies um, in ways that are meant to sort of shore up this new womanhood. So we had this like new manhood in the medieval period. Now we got this new womanhood coming. And, um, women were essentially, I argue, given a new vocation as clerical wives once again and that this had political and social implications that were really important and had to be communicated to people. So they were communicated through the churching rite and the way that that was reformed to sort of reflect this new status of women, or they think it's a new status for women. um, so anyhow, that is the short, very generalized, literally 1,000-year stretch of history of churching. And I'm really eager to talk, especially at Leeds, about the texts that I am looking at specifically that sort of shore up my contention about women's bodies being used in this very specific way. And I think I have some pretty convincing stuff. We'll see. We'll see if my supervisors feel the same way. Um, but on that note, I will introduce Francesca. Oh, Francesca will introduce herself because she's better at that.
Well, yeah, thank you very much, Autumn. As always, lovely to hear your research. I can't wait to, discuss a bit further today and it leads about where all of our research intersects. Yes, I'm Francesca. I'm a PhD student at the University of Nottingham. And I'm sort of in the final stages, finishing a bit early, but just kind of writing up that final draft. Um, as I mentioned sort of earlier today, my focus is on Old Norse literature, so predominantly the Icelandic sagas, specifically the Fornaldarsogur or the legendary sagas. And although that might sound vastly disparate from what Autumn has introduced so far and what James might go on to talk about shortly, there's actually a lot, especially about women's bodies, that has been come to my attention in my scholarship. So, although my thesis is predominantly about animal forms and sort of the differences and connections between human animal hybridity and consciousness in the body in these sagas, a kind of side quest of interest has come into women in these sagas and their own bodily autonomy. And so I thought I'd introduce a couple of examples today, just to kind of give some idea of how this manifests in these sagas. So for example, in one of the which generally thought was potentially one of the oldest Fornaldarsogur, like the oldest manuscript we had of is about 1250. As an example of a woman who, in order to create an heir to their family line who will be strong enough to take vengeance against an evil king who's overthrown them, she realizes that their Volsung blood cannot be diluted by any other one, any other family, and so she disguises herself as a seeress. They swap bodies, and she goes and she seduces her twin brother, and they conceive a child together. I know, mad stuff. But the point of this being that we see a woman who takes reproductive agency, it seems, in a way here, and we have a swapping of female bodies or a mingling of female bodies. And that subsequent child is purely Volsung. So the seeress's body, who she seems to be wearing at this point, seems not to be involved. But we have this kind of moment where her twin brother, who should be the kind of agentic Wilson heir, is, not aware of the child that they're creating there, which kind of very much contradicts medieval and going into early modern perceptions of generative power in conception and the fact that that was, a male preserve, as kind of suggested by Aquinas, Augustine, many other kind of influential scholars of the medieval period. So that was one point of interest that kind of drew my attention. Another is in a later saga, so kind of moving almost into early modern period, where Autumn focuses, is the saga of King Rolf Kraki, where we have the story of a man who is cursed by his stepmother to be sort of a werebear. So he's a bear by day and a man by night. And yet his lover can still recognize him even when he's in the bear form, and he kind of leads her away back to his cave and he becomes a man again. And after several nights together, he informs her that that day he will die, he'll be hunted by his father, but she's carrying his three triplets. And unfortunately, the next day, as everything happens and he's hunted and killed by his father, who's none the wiser who the bear is, his lover is forced by this evil stepmother to consume some of the bear meat. And she consumes two and a half morsels. And so her triplets, the first one is an elk from the waist down. The second son is has the feet of a dog or a hound. And the third is supposedly unmarked because she spat out the final piece. And yet he somehow has this kind of bear spirit that he sends out onto the battlefield. And so it's very interesting seeing kind of where in this one saga, women's bodies are very much vulnerable to this kind of consumption corruption. And the unborn children, it's kind of they're empowered by their father who has conceived them. But as soon as the mother succumbs to this kind of very, original sin type narrative of, being compelled or convinced to eat of something forbidden, the children are corrupted by that, just as, the generations of mankind following Adam and Eve are supposedly corrupted as well. Um, and in the same saga, you have moments of men consuming blood or body parts of other creatures, and even their own brother, who like Bodvar drinks the blood of his brother's calf and suddenly becomes stronger, or a man who'd previously been a coward drinks some of a beast's blood, and suddenly he becomes, one of the hero's retainers, and he's the bravest of all of them. And so for men, internalizing these kinds of substances into their bodies, kind of blending bodies with others, it's a situation of empowerment and strengthening. Whereas for women, it's dangerous, it's corruptive, and it has much longer lasting implications in that it's passed on to the next generation too. And so it both imbues women with agency to have this control over that, but also kind of an inherent weakness that the saga seems to imply there, that, women are only weakened by that. So I find it an interesting juxtaposition there in that saga, and certainly something to think about in relation to kind of other instances that are similar to this, especially in the fact that kind of the hero consuming the heart and blood of a beast and becoming more heroic and gaining their kind of eponymous title usually derives from that. And just the fact that a lot of my research also focuses on the learned medieval texts that would likely have influenced how these scholars were, however intentionally, understanding the boundaries of the body and the consciousness, and their perceptions of women, as likely informed by scholars like Isidore or Augustine, Aquinas, even older church fathers as well, like Origen. And so I think it's yeah, definitely very telling of what we can read into what seems like quite fantastical and bizarre narrative stories there. But yes, I will pass over to James now to tell you a bit about himself and his research, and hopefully connect this all together with where our interests lie. So I'll pass over to you now, James.
Well, I got the difficult job then. Thank you, Francesca. That actually reminds me, there is a French medieval fable about a werewolf. And he um, becomes a werewolf periodically, finally tells his wife about it, and because she's wondering where he disappears to periodically. And he tells her that if his clothes are ever stolen while he is in werewolf form, he remains a werewolf forever. And so she conspires with a lover to steal his clothes and leave him as a werewolf. And she then, he gets adopted by the king as like this big, giant, cuddly dog. And at one point, the wife and her new bigamous husband uh, are visiting the king's court. And the werewolf attacks her, rips off her nose, and then ultimately it comes out, what had happened. But the story ends by saying that her family was always known because all of the girls were born without noses. So there's an interesting connection there with this idea of not, of the women kind of carrying the sin through their bodies.
And
Yeah,
James made me
absolutely.
read this when he taught me French, and we had a good time. I thought of the exact same thing when Francesca was speaking.
Did you?
Well, because in the in Rolf Saga, where you had the whole werebear situation, his son Bodvar, who kind of has this bear spirit that he sends out, there's a really random part at the end that no one can really make sense of why it happens, where one of Rolf's heroes is like they've been out drinking and they realize that they were late to the battle and it's the final culminating battle. And this guy wakes up with his lover who he kind of blames her for distracting him. And so he bites off her nose. And then he
Oh,
runs and goes and wakes up Bodvar, who had been in this like trance-like state, sending out the bear spirit onto the battlefield. And so it's a very similar parallel there that we get a lover whose
yeah.
nose is bitten off and this kind of werewolf or here werebear cured in a way, like because Bodvar can control it, but he needed reminding, no, you've got to go out on the battlefield as a man and do manly things, not supernatural things. And so yeah,
Mm.
it does make me think what kind of influence these French folk tales and lays might have had on the Old Norse. But yeah, definitely a connection.
And possibly, yeah, there's in the French one, it mentions it's very adamant that the knight, who is the werewolf, has never attacked anyone. He's always been, like I said, just this big, giant, cuddly dog. And but he attacks the woman. And so the advisors convince the king that there must be some previous relationship there, or he must have done something bad to a point. And that's when they get her to bring his clothes back. He turns back into a human and all of that. Yeah, there has to be either some sort of direct connection or a general cultural idea of the nose as a vital marker for someone. Yeah, so turning to my own work. So I'm James White. I'm a assistant lecturer at the University of Alberta. I finished my PhD, I think 3 years ago now, specifically on the medieval devotion to Jesus's foreskin, with the idea that um, the Lineages had a very strong fascination with the humanity component of Jesus. Um, Jesus is both divine and human, and they were very focused on the human component. And the idea was that the book of Luke in the Bible says that Jesus was circumcised when he was 8 days old, like Jewish boys are. And so the idea developed that if there was any part of Jesus's body still left on earth, it would be his foreskin. There were about 25 churches that all claimed to have this relic. Medieval people did not really have a difficulty with duplication of relics. Um, but there were about 25 churches that claimed to have it. And a lot of my dissertation focuses on three women who had very intense interactions or visions of Jesus's foreskin. For woman, Catherine of Siena in the late 1300s, um, had the idea that Jesus married all religious virgins, which that idea was fairly common. That idea was fairly common in the late Middle Ages. But in Catherine's conception, he married all religious virgins by giving them his foreskin as a wedding ring. She writes very frequently about really almost kind of a foreshadowing that this little 8-year-old, sorry, not 8-year, 8-day-old infant purposely gave up just enough flesh to form the circlet of a ring. Um, and it and the idea also plays into the circumcision, the first that Jesus shed blood, and then later at the crucifixion, he sheds blood again. And of course, during the Eucharist, there is the idea of the body and the blood of Christ. And so this is seen as the first shedding of the blood of Christ. So that is what my dissertation, um, my PhD. Um, Subsequently, I've become more interested in the um, Jewish components of this and the ways that having a circumcised savior kind of is trying to fit a square peg into a round hole for late medieval Christians who were often quite anti, um, but they have a savior who was Jewish. Body has been, because he was circumcised, his body is irrevocably Jewish. And late medieval people did not practice circumcision, or at least late medieval Christians did not. So part of my work at the moment is figuring out how the many different ways that they kind of do mental gymnastics to reconcile denigrating circumcision among contemporary late medieval Jews while worshiping circumcised Savior. And my other area of research that I'm going into, excuse me, my other area of research is looking at the ways that women use their bodies physically during prayer, during trances, um, looking at a lot of sex lives to determine if there are trends in the ways that men bodies versus how women use their bodies, are they space differently in the holy space. And so part of this is looking at the transmission of knowledge through saints' lives and saints' writings, particularly these women, and how much of their writings reflect their own input versus having words put in their mouths by male authors or male co-authors. And then secondly, how their very bodies transmit visual knowledge simply by being seen or not seen. What does it mean? What does it mean? What does it mean if the local holy woman is praying in a particular way in front of the church versus in the back of the church? How does this interact with with the spread of knowledge of Christianity among the laity, among the average everyday person? What does it mean to see her doing that? Those are some of the questions that I'm starting to grapple with now with this new project.
So, I was just saying that you kind of already answered this, Francesca. But I'm curious about the texts that have, specifically been influential in your work when you're studying about how ideas about women and their bodies, either were transmitted or the bodies used to transmit other ideas. And what is unique about those works? And I know, James, you've talked previously about different saints' visions, and I wonder, are there specific texts that you looked at um, that really kind of spurred this interest and got you thinking about transmission of knowledge in this way?
Yeah, there are. That's actually how I came to the PhD topic in the first place. Um, is with Catherine of Siena. She's the woman who has the um, foreskin wedding rings. in the late 1300s. And Catherine is an extremely well documented uh, woman for the Middle Ages. We have a very long hagiography, a holy biography of her. It's about 500 pages in the modern English translation, which is very, very long. And clearly written with the idea of getting her canonized. This was written by her confessor, and it's not written just to celebrate Catherine. It's very much written with a goal in mind. If you can, excuse me, if you can think of any type of holy act that a saint can do, Catherine is doing it in this biography. She's literally like a checklist that we've got to hit everything on. So we have an extremely long biography of her that really emphasizes, again, the miracles, the bodily action. She does things like drinking pus as penance. She has visions of drinking Jesus's blood directly from his side wound. So the biography really emphasizes her mystical side. But we also know that Catherine was extremely political. She was involved with bringing the papacy back from Avignon to Rome, and she was constantly calling for a new crusade. She wrote letters, dictated letters, to really anyone she could think of. The King of France, the Queen of Naples, the King of Hungary, an English mercenary soldier, family, friends, local, local, I mean Italian, Northern Italian, Tuscan religious leaders, nuns, abbots. She has a lot of letters to popes, in which she feels that she has the authority to tell the popes that they're not doing a good job as being pope, which I really like that she stands up to the pope. But we have 380 letters, and they really do seem to be Catherine's authentic words, because they were written down by her secretaries, who would be presumably faithful to what she had said, because they did believe in her as a holy woman. And the imagery and the language is quite similar throughout the letters. It's indicative that they're all generated by the same person. But what I find really interesting and what initially got me into all of this, is that in her own writings, Catherine doesn't talk about her bodily mystical experiences. The closest she comes is that this is where she discusses the foreskin wedding rings, which do not appear in the otherwise very body-based biography. And the biography, it's just a pretty little gold diamond ring. For Catherine's the foreskin. And so that's what I got initially, was figuring out, okay, how is Catherine using body to transmit knowledge in a different way than her confessor, her biographer, does when he really emphasizes body for everything else? Why is there this slippage there? Why is it reversed? That she's emphasizing Jesus's body a great deal there, when it when you would expect it to show up in very body-based biography.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Sounds like, I mean, whew, you have a lot of textual material to work with. That's incredible.
And
Um,
she also has a it's called the dialogue, theological. Um, which is a conversation between the soul, which is usually
Yeah.
understood to be Catherine herself, and God. And then we have a collection of her prayers that she wrote. She's incredibly well documented.
Yeah,
And
hypergraphia.
there are a couple of other short lives, Catherine, as well.
Cool though. In my own work, I have I wouldn't say it's a huge problem, but I don't have as many awesome direct sources in the sense that when I'm looking at texts, I'm looking at a huge variety of things. But a couple of things are specifically important to my work. One, liturgy, obviously, written liturgy. But the thing about written liturgy, for anybody that doesn't know, is that it's not like today when you go into mass and you get a missal and you follow along. There were what are known as uses, the use of Sarum, the use of York, which was, standard cathedral. This is how we do liturgy. But even then, it was never ever compiled until like the modern period into like an actual book. And it only tells us what the ideal for ceremony would have been in a cathedral setting. It doesn't tell us anything about how people were operating in parish churches. And that's really interesting because scholars have tended to assume that, because the use of Sarum, for instance, Salisbury Cathedral, um, because it kind of has become like the big one, the main one. It was just always assumed, or for a while assumed that everybody was just using this use when they were doing parish liturgy. But we have no reason to actually believe that. And in fact, I would argue, um, given just sort of religious history in England anyway, there was so much regional variation happening on a literal day-to-day basis. And so how this relates to churching is I have no like quintessential example. It's not like I have the mass, right? Which even though itself has variations regionally, at least has a core set of elements. With churching in the Sarum rite and the Sarum use of Sarum, you have like a one page and it's very vague. It's just like the priest comes in, priest says this, priest assistant does that, woman kneels down. And you can find fragments of churching references in other places, just wherever. And so we know, the woman had to come and kneel down in front of the church, and the priest would meet her out there and sprinkle her and do prayers and bring her inside. And but it's interesting working with sources because for me, I'm having to make a lot of inferences, and then on top of that, acknowledge just how incredibly diverse were folk practices in England. Um, so there's the liturgy, but I have an early modern source that I really love because it tells me it basically makes me feel good about my argument because it basically bolsters it. And that's when we get into polemical literature in the 17th century. So we have what's, called the pamphlet wars in England in the 17th century. People were angrily writing back and forth and publishing these things. And it was an amazing like genre of literature that people are taking very seriously now, but which in its time was just, shit posting, right? So, I mean, not so much. There was, it was serious stuff, but it could also be inflammatory. It was very inflammatory. So anyhow, there's one pamphlet that I've managed to find specifically about churching. And it's fascinating to me because it is written from the voice and viewpoint of a woman. I can only imagine it's not actually written by a woman. I don't actually know because it is anonymous, but I'm going to assume it's not a woman for many, many reasons. And one of those is that it is taking incredible pains to show how Catholicism is supposedly just terrible for women and degrading for women, and how this new reformed view, which sounds very Calvinistic when you read it, is like gives women so much freedom, so much agency, right? We're not impure anymore. And it's such an interesting thing because there is this strain throughout some literature during the Reformation that tries to make that very point that, we're better for women, so come join us. which is interesting, very interesting for many, many reasons. One reason is, I argue, they have to rehabilitate women if women are now going to be part of clerical marriage, right? They can't be these temptresses and these horribly impure. Well, that's very generalized, and medieval people didn't necessarily think that either. But these in the texts written about as though they are these corrupting influences and things like that. So this, I think, was a calculated move. And this is why I think this was not actually written by a woman who was just super into, Protestant thought and really liberated by it. But even today, you'll see theologians who are writing about Luther and how Luther is a proto-feminist. I think that's going a bit far, but he does develop this maternal theology. Um, I would argue it's not as liberatory as maybe people want to make it out to be, but it is different and it is deliberately juxtaposed with Catholicism. So, all that to say, I have these variety of sources um, that help me understand how people who like maybe read the pamphlet or listened to Luther's writings, somebody read Luther's writings, or you know, uh, funeral sermons is another really rich area for me because they would take the life of a woman who had died and talk about like how wonderfully pious she was and in what ways, and these ways miraculously coincide with how to be a really good early modern wife and um, so there were all these ways these ideas were transmitted, and I have to get a little creative because there's very little reference to churching in just about anything. Um, it's every day I find little bits more, and it's not like there's nothing, but I do have to make a lot of inferences when I talk about why I am making this specific argument. I have to sort of fill in a gap and make it convincing, and I find it convincing. I'm hoping others will too. But it's definitely a process of making connections and positing these ideas. So. Yeah, those are my sources. I love that pamphlet, but funny enough, it's in the dissertation, but it's not as much of a focus as I want it to be. And I think I'm going to do something with it later on because it's kind of just there to make a specific point in a specific chapter. And I really want to do just, I don't know, it's such a cool thing. You can read it just about anywhere. It's Internet Archive, but anyway, that's kind of my thing here. I do want to ask another question because I think this is a really important one. So there's often a debate about whether misogyny was really at issue when it came to religious ideas about women's bodies. And some scholars focus, like, for example, on like an amoral humoral theory as the driver for many statements about the like precarity or inferiority of female bodies. But have you encountered this debate in your own work, and what's your own opinion?
Yeah, I think I don't know, it's interesting seeing where humoral theory does kind of crop up, especially in the kind of, the source material that my PhD which is about, which is, um very fantastical and, almost entirely entertainment-based literature. So you would think that it kind of, doesn't engage with these kinds of theories and sort of, therefore lacks an ability to engage with, these debates about is it, an inherently amoral theory? Is it kind of, a deliberate attack of, misogyny against society? Um, and against women. And I think, because of the freedom of the legendary sagas to not have to commit to being, despite, almost certainly being written in the literate communities of Iceland, which would have been, clerical institutions that are governed by, doctrine and Christian practice. I think they're kind of, they build a lot more on what would have been a very kind of, I don't know, human and real understanding and experience of these theories and how they govern your everyday life. And so when you have, examples of, humoral theory, which presents women as being, these kind of inherently weaker beings and, kind of the cold, wet, and therefore cannot, handle
power and agency in society. I think you kind of see that challenged in these sagas, and whether that's because it's kind of a relic of a time before Scandinavian culture could engage with the literature and the doctrine and the scholarly debates that kind of promoted these theories, or whether it's kind of an answer of, I mean, Scandinavian law, especially in Iceland, even, into their Christianization, was still much more favorable towards women. It was, still, don't get me wrong, probably largely androcentric, but there was a lot more freedom for women to have agency, and especially of their own bodies in terms of marriage and children and agency to govern the household. Um, and so, whether it's part of what was like an inherent part of Scandinavian society that kind of challenged what is often seen as, more misogynistic towards women, and therefore makes it, not seen quite as amoral, or not quite as, yeah, distinctly aggressive towards female bodies, or whether it's just, a nature of the kind of origins of these sagas and where they derive from. I think it's still interesting to see how that interplays, and I think you can really read it either way with a lot of them. And just because of the variety of the material spanning a couple centuries in terms of transmission and then transcription and then popularization, there's such a mingling, and 1 minute you can see it the one side and 1 minute the other. But yeah, I don't know, how does that really manifest in your work, Autumn or James?
Um, yeah, from my end, I'll talk about Catherine again because I always want to talk about Catherine. And then I'll talk about the humoral theory component. There's actually a scene in Catherine's biography, um, the male authored one, in which she wants to she wants to dress and become a Dominican monk. Catherine ultimately became a Dominican tertiary, so she remained a laywoman, but had strong affiliations with the Dominican order, um, and was assigned a specific confessor and all of that. But there's a scene when she's younger where she wants to dress as a man, become a Dominican monk, and be able to go out in the world and preach. And the biography says, even before that, there's a little bit of foreshadowing, that the biography refers to says that her parents gave her the nickname Euphrosyne. And Euphrosyne is one of the very early Christian transgender saints, of a woman who lived as a man, as a monk in a monastery. And in Catherine's instance, she is ultimately told, she receives a vision from God telling her that she doesn't need to do this. She doesn't need to live as a man, but she will still have the ability to do what would otherwise be considered masculine public activities, but she doesn't need to live or dress as a man in order to do it. So there's an interesting component there where, again, this biography that is being written for the express purpose of getting her canonized, not just to celebrate her, but we've got to check off the list and get her canonized, includes this element where she wants to transcend her sex. She wants to go into more of the virago position. And it's only God himself who dissuades her from doing that. And yet it's still an included component in the biography when it otherwise could have been completely left out. So that's the Catholic component that I will always include. With the humoral theory, there are, I've just finished teaching a class on the Crusades, and there are some crusading texts that advocate for women to go on crusade, not as military fighters, but for women to be part of the Crusades, because the idea with humoral theory that if you abstain from sex, it's unhealthy. And so these women, the wives of the Crusaders, need to go with them so that the Crusaders can have church sanctioned marital sex with their wives, because otherwise they're going to be turned into sex workers. Um, and in order to maintain that humoral balance. So yeah, with the misogyny, it's interesting because we always hear about um, the idea of hysteria and the wandering womb, and if the woman hasn't had sex, her uterus starts moving about her body and she goes into panic and all of this stuff. But a lot of medieval medical texts actually, when they discuss gynecology and discuss sex, they emphasize that it's important for both sides, for both men and for women, to have sex, because otherwise the man can build up too much heat. The woman requires the man's heat in order uh, for her womb not to go fluttering about everywhere. And there are actually in some of these treatises um, prescriptions or descriptions of pessaries filled with uh, the hot herbs. And of course, as we know, the designation of something as hot or cold was really completely arbitrary. But the hot herbs in the pessary, which is essentially a medieval dildo, for women to use on themselves if they are a widow, for example, and therefore do have um, morally sanctioned, ready access to a sexual relationship. So the misogyny component, I think, it's certainly there. As Francesca mentioned, it's definitely an androcentric society, but I think that there's nuance that's required with it. You can't just say misogyny, done. You have to look at individual instances of particular people, but also circumstances like, who would think, as in my students, for example, always say, really, they wanted women to go on crusade so they could have sex? That's not something that you would consider. So it demonstrates a utility that they saw women serving um, for the greater good of Christendom, within the terms of the Crusades, at least.
Yeah, I deal a lot with that specific subject too in my courses, and uh, so much so that my 10-year-old daughter told someone at her school that her mom teaches sex at the university. So that was really had to explain myself on that one. But she sat in on a class where we were talking about those pessaries and about hot and cold and how you had to relieve that. So yeah, there's a lot of nuance. And I think this is interesting because it's really at the heart of my work, of course, talking about women and purification and what that means. Um, and it's interesting how almost different disciplines have interacted with these ideas. So a lot of feminist scholarship has been very, very helpful, excuse me, in pointing out certain misogynistic elements, things like that, but some of it suffers from a bit of like presentism, in that they don't always consider that the meaning of purity was different, especially religiously. Um, so, for example, with churching, um, in the Levitical text, of course, because it was a Levitical rite, Jews didn't have a sense of sin as like a morally culpable thing when it comes to these purity laws anyway. right? Everybody would be ritually impure at some point, just from having come in contact with ritually impure matter, etc. There wasn't like a moral imputation to it. So people would hear about women and like menstruation and tents and whatever, and kind of take these modern ideas about what that might mean and impose them on the past. And I don't think they're entirely wrong, but they're like 85% wrong. And that's the thing I think people forget about history is that there's not a one answer kind of thing. You know, these rules, these laws, these cultural habits, they come about through many, many years of just life, lots of different people living and interpreting the world around them. And so, you know, studying churching has been very interesting in that sense because there seems to be an emphasis on deciding whether in churching people are talking about this ritual purity that does not have a moral imputation to it, or whether it's a moral impurity and they're saying women are bad and women are whatever. And like the good post-revisionist I am, I'm arguing that it's both. And that people over time, especially in the Christian Western European context, were able to see within things like humoral theory, especially like very Aristotelian inflected humoral theory. De Secretis Mulierum is a text that was written to explain, supposedly explain reproduction to monks. You know, and it very clearly takes on a lot of these very heavily misogynistic views of women and their morality and their susceptibility to Satan and all of these things. So I mean, there's room for both. You also have this cleric I was just reading about the other day who was really grappling with this question in the 12th century, or sorry, 13th century, and he was trying to figure out like, why do we have to church women? Are they like they didn't do anything wrong, but there's this impurity, and he's really wrestling with it. And he decides that it's a period of rest. That's what it is. Women have to sit out for 4 weeks so they can rest, which is very generous of him, but and is an interpretation that has survived for a very long time, but I think is just born out of his, you know, compassionate heart rather than perhaps reality. So you do have these different forces, and I think we have to grapple with that. I think we cannot come down on the side of one or the other, as James pointed out. Um, and I think it is more fruitful for our scholarship to be able to be flexible on these ideas and to see where each source sort of takes us and you know, why this person wrote about purity in this way or why they wrote about women in this way. And could it be that they're not even consistent? Because that's the other thing is we always assume people are internally consistent, and I have never met a human being that is internally consistent. So, you know, with the De Secretis Mulierum, again, I can point out the misogynistic elements, and then I can point out places where I think those things have been misinterpreted. So yeah. And on that note, it is exactly 12 p.m. Well, okay, 12 p.m. my time, but it's been an hour. So I really hope you have enjoyed this little taste of what's in store at the International Medieval Congress in Leeds. Once again, our talk, if you're there, is Monday, July 7th at 7 p.m. It's session number 407. And afterwards, there's going to be, you know, a chance to hang out with us because we're really cool and, you know, you want to. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed today and do feel free to reach out if you are interested in doing a talk for us or a guest post on our blog. And then Francesca, I'm sorry, do you want to tell us when our next talk is? I keep getting it confused. Do you want to quickly just say a word about it and what it is?
Yes, so our next talk, I believe it's the last weekend of June because it's yeah, sort of after Leeds conference now. And yeah, we're gonna
July,
be
you mean?
Sorry, yeah,
Sorry.
end of July. Sorry. Yes, and we'll be hearing from a scholar from Australia who is talking about representation of like skin color and blackness in Old Norse literature. So very interesting stuff, interesting ideas of body as well. I will also shamelessly plug my own talk, which is happening on the Monday as well, before our own roundtable discussion at Leeds. It's at 4 p.m. So, as I will obviously be at both, there is time to get from one to another, and that'll focus more on the textual transmission of scholarly ideas and like clerical institutions between Iceland, Scandinavia, and the rest of Europe at the time, called Legends and Learning. So feel free to come along to that. I think I speak for both myself, Autumn, and James when I say that the roundtable discussion will probably somewhat resemble what we've discussed today, but I think no doubt we've probably all identified other areas and things that we want to, dig into more detail and parts that, we all didn't get to say or ask today that will lead to just even more exciting discussions at Leeds. So, certainly more to contribute, think about, and hear there.
Yes, yes, and thank you. I'm sorry I didn't mention your talk. I totally forgot. Then, James, I think you also have a session independent of our roundtable. Is that correct?
Yes, I have a session. I believe it's on the Friday or the Thursday. I'm in the program.
Look me up.
eh, Look me up. And it's going to be about again the ways that the that late medieval Christians attempted to reconcile worship force in themselves being anti-Jewish and kind of the mental gymnastics that they employ in doing that. So that will be my session. As I said, it's on the
Amazing.
Thursday or Friday.
That's fantastic. And I'm sad that I'm going to miss it because I have to go hang with the in-laws, combine a holiday with my conference. But
Well,
great.
my
Well,
part, my part will be virtual, so you can just tune
that's
in for
right.
that.
I'm gonna watch it. I'm gonna be right there. And then we had Laura Gathigan on here um, last month talking about her biography of Matilda of Flanders that is organized by body. It's organized corporeally. Fascinating. She is having I think a book talk there. She'll be around. She's gonna come to our session, so you can come hang with her as well. Yeah, we've got so much good stuff happening, but definitely check out our Eventbrite page, our Blue Sky account, our YouTube page, everything. And we will see you next month,
Bye,
next week.
Bye.
everyone. See you all. Thanks for today.
Bye bye. Oh, it's still recording. Hang on.